Welcome to the New Books Network.
Welcome to Madison's Notes. We are the official podcast of the James Madison Program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. I'm Laura Laurent, and today we will be discussing freedom of speech and critical inquiry in the context of the 2024 American presidential election. Here today, we welcome Professors Amna Khalid and Jeff Snyder. Now, Professor Khalid is an associate professor in the Department of History at Carleton College, where she specializes in modern South Asian history, the history of medicine, and the global history of free expression. Professor Snyder is also a professor at Carleton College in the Department of Educational Studies. He is a historian of education whose work examines questions about race, national identity, and the purpose of a public education in a diverse and democratic society. Now, Professors Khalid and Snyder speak regularly together about academic freedom, freedom of speech, and campus politics at colleges and universities across the country, so it is going to be a fantastic conversation for this week's episode. Thanks for joining in. Welcome to the show, Jeff and Amna. It is wonderful to have both of you here on Princeton's campus. You two will be giving a lecture this evening, early November, but post-election, so we're recording this episode while you're both physically here, which is unique sometimes for the way we do things with Madison's Notes. Welcome.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Awesome. Well, you two do a lot of collaboration in the realm of academic freedom and free speech. But before we get into the collaborative efforts that you both do, I'm curious for each of you individually, and maybe Amna, you can start. Can you tell us how you came to care so much about this subject and to start to put some of your academic and professional focus on this specific area?
It's a great opening question, but also one where I can talk for hours and hours. So do cut me off if I am over speaking. Very quickly, I come to the U.S. Via Britain and South Africa. Britain is where I did my postgraduate degree, and Pakistan is where I did my undergraduate degree. And I taught in South Africa for 2 years before coming to the U.S. So I think to answer your question about why this is so important to me, I have to reflect on the context that I'm coming from. And in Pakistan, I grew up under a series of military dictatorships. I know exactly what happens when censorship begins to take hold in a society, particularly in educational institutions. And for me, what's concerning and why I started investing myself in this area of, academic inquiry and perhaps even academic activism is precisely because I come from a context where I've seen how quickly your public education system can be ripped apart. And it takes decades and decades to build those kinds of institutions that the rest of us outside of the U.S. look to the U.S. with envy. We admire the kinds of higher education institutions that have been set up, and not just higher education, but public education in general in the United States has always had an exceptional reputation across the world. To arrive here, to have made personal sacrifices precisely to have the freedom to think, and arrive in the U.S., which held this promise, and to see that being undermined from across the political spectrum was extremely disturbing. And that's what made me think about getting more involved in this area. My own expertise is in South Asian history and history of medicine. So it has been quite a switch, but one that I've felt passionately enough about to dedicate all my time and energy to speaking about it, to writing about it, and to hoping that people will be able to distance themselves from the politics of it all and recognize that academic freedom in particular is crucial for any kind of open inquiry.
Thank you. Jeff, how did you come to put your focus on academic freedom and freedom of speech?
So I started teaching at Carleton College, a small liberal arts college in Minnesota, in the fall of 2012. And within, the next academic year, I think 2013, 2014, I had a student come to my office hours and say, I think you should have included a trigger warning for the reading that we did yesterday in class. And I had never heard this phrase before, and I asked the student to explain, what is that? And I was open-minded and curious. That was my attitude, was one of curiosity when I first heard this term. Like, what's this all about? But the more that I read about it, the more concerned that I became that if we required or encouraged professors to put trigger warnings on syllabi or to issue trigger warnings in class before particular discussions, that about half of what I teach as a historian who focuses on the modern United States would be potentially subject to a trigger warning, and that I anticipated if this trend continues, it's going to be very difficult for me to teach some of the core subjects from my classes. So I teach a class called Will This Be on the Test? Standardized Testing in American Education. And the first part of the class is a historical exploration of the origins of standardized testing, which are very intertwined with the invention of intelligence testing and IQ tests. And every single one of the major IQ testing architects and proponents was a eugenicist. And so we do about a week on eugenics. And eugenics is an incredibly disturbing topic that includes all sorts of sensitive material. And I worried that were students to have a mechanism where they could say, hey, hold on a second, I'm not sure that I want to read this book or see these images, that whole parts of my curriculum were possibly on the chopping block. So that's how I initially became interested, was as a professor at a liberal arts institution where I could see these threats to academic freedom really impeding my ability to teach my course in the most accurate and powerful way. And if I could just add an addendum to that, when Amna and I first started writing on these issues, we wrote about trigger warnings, we wrote about bias response teams, we wrote about campus diversity initiatives and DEI offices, and we were often critiquing, at least what our colleagues saw as a critique of the left or people who were interested in social justice. But then, circa 2020, 2021, you had an incredibly important movement from outside of the academy. These threats to academic freedom were coming from inside the academy, trigger warnings and these kinds of things. But you started to see anti-critical race theory legislation in red states like Florida, the Stop Woke Act being the iconic kind of example of this kind of legislation. And here was a threat coming from outside of academia that was also impinging on the freedom to teach and learn in a classroom. So that kind of re-energized both Amna and I in terms of kind of a whole nother stream or strand of a whole nother area of concern, these red state laws passed in red state legislatures.
Can I just add on to that? When I first came here, I was very used to legislators or people in authority, in terms of political authority, cracking down on the freedom to speak and the freedom to think. So I was really taken aback when I saw that kind of push coming from within campuses, and it was, of course, cloaked in progressive values and things that I actually agree with in many ways. So I was really taken aback by that at the outset when I first came. But since 2020, as Jeff was saying, when in red states legislators started going for directing what can and can't be taught in the classroom, that's very familiar territory to me from where I come from. And I, under no circumstances, can endorse that kind of intervention and feel it as my responsibility as a global citizen to push back against it. We're very used to Americans taking on the mantle of pushing things globally. I'd like to kind of reverse the tables here and say there's plenty that the U.S. could learn from the rest of the world in this moment and recognize that this is a dangerous move.
I'm really curious about your collaboration together? Were you both at Carleton College and you found that you had this similar interest? Was it something you were at a dinner party and you realized you both were writing on the same topic at the same place? What was the moment that your collaboration was formed?
This was back in 2016, and Carleton was considering having a bias response team. I'd never heard of such things. They were truly, I had never encountered them. And a professor friend of mine, dragged me to the town hall, and she said, come. It was over lunch. Actually, I wasn't intending to go because I didn't even understand what it was. But as I sat there and heard about what was being proposed, this was still in early stages, and they were kind of brainstorming and presenting what they thought would be a good bias response team. I remember the hairs at the back of my neck standing and thinking, oh dear God, I have ended up from the frying pan into the fire, because if this is what thinking people believe is the right approach towards cultivating a culture of tolerance and open inquiry, God help us, So it was very reminiscent to me. It's not entirely the same, of course, but the feeling I had at that moment was very similar to what I used to feel like in Pakistan when people tried to shut down what you were saying, either in the name of, or either by classifying it as anti-religion or by anti-state or anti-military. And it was in the aftermath of that town hall, I was so appalled by what I had heard that Jeff and I actually, we'd known each other as colleagues across campus, but we'd really never connected. But Jeff was equally incensed, and we met up for a cup of coffee to discuss this proposal. And at the end of that coffee, I remember Jeff just saying, hey, do you want to write something with me on this? And that was the start of what has ended up being quite a long and productive partnership.
Fantastic. Now, I'd love to get into more about the state of free inquiry on campuses. But before we do that, I think it's really important for our listeners and also for ourselves to have a really good understanding of the approach that we're taking when we talk about the purpose of the university. And I know that your perspective of the purpose of the university isn't always in line with what people think. Sometimes the purpose of the university is labeled as truth-seeking, this like discovery to find the ultimate truth. Can you tell me about your perspective of what the purpose of the university is and how that contrasts with how people maybe traditionally think of higher education and higher learning?
Whenever Amna and I give public talks about free speech or about the purpose of the education, we have this one quote that we really like from a federal judge called Kevin Newsom. He was writing in 2022, and he said, "The chief mission of colleges and universities is to, quote, equip students to examine arguments critically, and perhaps even more importantly, to prepare young citizens to participate in the civic and political life of our democratic republic." So if you look at the mission statements of colleges and universities over the past 100 years or so, you see consistently that there are two main themes or two main objectives. One is knowledge-seeking, truth-seeking, the dissemination of knowledge. From a student's perspective, that's about inculcating critical thinking. And then another important theme or strand or objective is that of preparing students to be informed and engaged citizens. And so this morning, I actually went and looked at the Princeton mission statement. And one of the, of course, there's a lot about research and learning and scholarship. But there's a little section here where it says, among the university's defining characteristics and aspirations include, quote, a commitment to prepare students for lives of service, civic engagement, and ethical leadership. And so it's been our impression that a lot of people in the higher ed space, pundits, professors, commentators, when they are talking about the mission of the university, they really tend to focus on these purely or strictly academic features. But especially if you look at what colleges and universities are actually doing, it's hard to not see how important citizenship, civic engagement, whatever exact term you want to use, it's really deeply important to the overwhelming majority of the some 4,000 colleges and universities in the United States at this point.
I think when we think about the mission of the university, Jeff has quite rightly pointed out that there are these two arms to it. One is critical thinking, and the other one is citizenship. But I want to reflect a little bit more on what we mean by critical thinking and critical inquiry. And I think for a long time, people have talked about the mission of the university as being truth-seeking. And let me be very clear, I am in no way saying that the mission of the university excludes truth-seeking. It is part of what we do. But the fact of the matter is that this is, as a historian, I'm very aware of the fact that, concepts and missions and ideas and categories don't, descend from heaven fully conceived. They're actually contingent in the historical circumstances where they're being produced. So for me, the mission of the university as truth-seeking is very much reflective of the early 20th century, late 19th, early 20th century, when we'd shifted away from capital T truth to small t truth, but it was still rooted in the idea, a positivist idea, where the idea was that there was a truth to be accessed. Now, that is definitely the case in many fields and lines of inquiry that are part of the academy. But much has happened in the academy since then. And to boil it down to saying it's truth-seeking is actually alienating many of the people who are within the academy. People in music and art and literature do not engage in these endeavors to find the truth. They do it to bring in a more expansive understanding of the human condition and human experience. And that, I think, needs to be reckoned with. There's been a wave of people who have critiqued this notion of critical inquiry, the way we've put it forward as the mission of the university, saying that, this is pandering to postmodernism or is derivative of post-structuralism. And the fact of the matter is, whether you like it or not, postmodernism and post-structuralism have been incredible movements in the history of thought in the 20th century and have allowed us to ask some very important questions that are at the heart of how we are conceiving of what it means to be a citizen even, right? So I just want to say that when we think about critical inquiry in the academy, we would like to have an umbrella which includes truth-seeking, but also incorporates what many of our colleagues are engaged in the university.
Well, if I can add on to that, I'm just looking at some stats here, right? So according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, across the country, we've got about 11,000 economics profs, about 12,000 profs who are in physics. Right. And at least from an outsider's view looking in, perhaps in physics, truth-seeking, looking for universal laws, I can imagine that's important. We certainly wouldn't want to say that's illegitimate. But then I'm looking at these numbers and see that there are 69,000 professors who are in art, drama, and music. And, whether you're talking about different interpretations of Moby Dick, whether you're talking about how to throw a clay pot, whether you're talking about learning a foreign language, Russian, French, Spanish, Mandarin, whatever it is, I'm not sure that the professors and especially the students who are engaged in those endeavors would think of it as being in the pursuit of truth. So on an empirical level, this idea that we're all in the business of truth-seeking just doesn't map on to what people are actually doing inside of classrooms and labs across college campuses. But if I could say one more quick point here, Amna and I, we've thought some about this issue, but neither of us are, philosophers in epistemology, or this isn't our area as historians. But we wanted to talk about the importance of both citizenship and kind of critical inquiry and knowledge seeking more broadly in order to try and create a bigger tent for people and organizations that are devoted to academic freedom and free expression. So the Academic Freedom Alliance is an organization we have incredible respect for. I'm a member. Amna was a founding member. Their tagline is solidarity in pursuit of truth. At least it was last time I went to the website, right? And I think that for a lot of these people, especially in humanities and interpretive social sciences, when they see that tagline, they don't see their own academic work reflected. And so part of this was just a pragmatic maneuver, like, hey, people, there's so many reasons to be concerned about threats to academic freedom and free speech. Let's broaden the tent beyond more empirically driven positivist conceptions of the nature of knowledge and scholarly inquiry.
Yeah, it's interesting as I studied philosophy in school, but I'm also very artistic and have a lot of creative pursuits. Mm-hmm. And when I think about the way that philosophy was taught to me in school, it was this like capital T, go find the answer. But in my creative life, if you try to find the answer, it doesn't exist. And that actually kind of destroys the creative heart of the human soul.
Well, that's exactly right, because I think, there's this idea of why do we care about academic freedom or free expression? A big component of that is the John Stuart Mill, the quest for truth or knowledge, however you want to put it. Absolutely at the heart of what we do on campuses. But there's a whole nother element to the importance of especially free expression, which is self-expression. And that doesn't ultimately lead to necessarily an assertion that can be reality tested, right? Is this true or false? I don't think that's the question that people are asking if they see a painting or if they read a poem. It's a completely different mode of inquiry. It's much more interpretive. And as you said, from the perspective of a student, you don't sit down to most art, I don't think, is driven by the pursuit of truth. I'm sure some of it is for some people, but I don't think that's the case for most people and most artists.
And to put an even finer point on it, like we even move away. We're not saying critical thinking alone. We're saying critical inquiry. And for that, we draw on what Dewey saw as the four natural human instincts.
John Dewey
saw as the four natural human instincts or interests. So 1 is conversation and communication, 2, investigation, 3, construction, and the 4th is artistic expression. That is the full range of how we explore and inquire. And that is what we're trying to say is the mission of the institute.
If I may say one more thing, I'm sorry, but we're here at Princeton University, and I got nothing but love for the Ivy League. I grew up in Hanover, New Hampshire, which is where Dartmouth College is, and my dad was a professor there. But the pursuit of truth as the only organizing idea for a collegiate mission is I think, elitist in a way that ignores a couple of different important features of higher ed. One is that 4 out of 10 undergraduates attend a community college, and that there are millions of students across the United States who are pursuing vocational education of some sort. And I actually think that critical inquiry, if you're talking about welding, for example, some sort of trade, it is an art, it is a science. I don't think the pursuit of truth is part of it, but I think that if you teach welding or computer coding, whatever it is, in a way that's not just about training and isn't super simplistic and reductive, it is a form of inquiry, learning a trade or a craft like that. So I think that it's broad enough to even incorporate a lot of vocational education, which, of course, at elite institutions, we don't even have it. We don't have a welding program. We don't have a business major at Carleton. We have an econ program, right? So I just think it's a broader, more capacious, more expansive way of thinking about and understanding higher ed that at least we hoped could be possibly useful, again, in enlisting more people in the cause of academic freedom and free expression.
Yeah, I want to go in next into sort of the state of free speech on campus. We've mentioned the Stop Woke Act. This is post-election, so there could be some other things we don't know yet. For my own experience, my freshman year in college was 2016, so that was the first Trump election, and freedom of speech kind of became a partisan issue associated with conservatism in that it was seen as conservative ideas and students were being shouted down, and therefore there needed to be a support of freedom of speech. I'm curious, is this the same now? Is that still how it's played out, or has the sort of freedom of speech and freedom of academic inquiry shifted over the last few years?
Well, free speech, I was going to say for better or for worse, but it is for worse. free speech since you joined college, since Trump 1.0, that first Trump administration. I'm a historian of education, and part of what I study is the intersection between schooling and the culture wars, and arguing that public schools, especially K-12 schools, are central sites for culture wars in the United States, from the teaching of evolution to critical race theory. But on college campuses during the first Trump administration, for a whole generation of college students, including, it sounds like yourself, the phrase free speech took on a very particular valence. It was culturally coded in a culture wars idiom and became seen by many students as a conservative or as a right-wing cause or as a conservative or a right-wing value. And I can understand that, because if you are an 18-year-old and you step onto campus, and no matter how good your civics program was in your high school, no matter how well-read you are, your understanding of academic freedom, free expression, free speech issues is probably pretty limited. But their first exposure to free speech was the likes of Milo Yiannopoulos, Richard Spencer, Ann Coulter, and other people who run the gamut from, I would say, right-wing provocateurs to neo-Nazis, coming to college campuses. And when they received, pushback and critiques about their right to speak, just to be clear, I think both Amna and I, if it's a public university and they've been invited, they should be allowed to speak. We don't want to deplatform them. But they then capitalized on that resistance to their appearances and draped themselves in the cloak of being free speech champions and free speech martyrs. And the notion that Milo Yiannopoulos is actually a champion of free speech is grotesque. It's comical. However, from the point of view of those students, that's what they're seeing. They're seeing some very far-right figures claiming that their free speech rights are being infringed upon. And students are interpreting that as, okay, I hear free speech. That means that what that means to me is that people have the license to say offensive things, especially about minorities and vulnerable populations. So sort of like free speech equals racism, free speech equals white supremacy, free speech equals transphobia. And I think that feature of the Trump era has just been incredibly damaging to, for lack of a better term, the branding, the currency of free speech in our culture. I think it's changing, and maybe Amna can jump in here and talk about how free speech as a term is it's evolving. I think it's taking on slightly different connotations now.
Well, I'd say, many of the people who were arguing for limiting free speech on campuses, who were driven by progressive values and were kind of reacting to the moment of Trump coming to power and these provocateurs, really coming to college campuses and causing mayhem and looking for attention. Well, I think that's shifted a little bit since the war in Gaza. And many of those students, or not just students, but constituencies on campus who were in favor of limiting speech are beginning to see how quickly it can be used to limit their own speech. And we've seen it in play. I think it's been a very eye-opening moment for American higher education to contend with some biases that it has had with respect to what can and cannot be discussed on campuses. And it's not a mystery to me that this has blown up around the issue of Palestine, which has always been a very heated topic, but one that institutions have preferred not to speak about. And have, it's not that I think institutions should be talking about it, but they have not fostered the kind of culture where people in their institutions can speak about this openly. So I think things are shifting a little bit, but I'm not going to go so far as to say things have changed, the tables have turned. Unfortunately, that's not the case. And neither am I looking to make a case that free speech belongs to the left. I think it belongs to us all. And that's the shift that I would like to see happening on college campuses and in terms of the culture on campuses. And we're far from that.
There's an interesting plot line here that tracks how we think about free expression on campus and the meaning of free speech. The phrase that Amna and I use is the discourse of harm. So the idea that being exposed to a particular speaker, idea, work of art, music, lyric, that if it is offensive or controversial or graphic, that it's going to cause students really significant psychological distress and harm, this kind of avoidance rationale. But I think what this moment has clarified is that I'm a Gen Xer, and REM was a big band when I was in high school and college, and they had a song that came out in the late 90s called Everybody Hurts. And I think what people are discovering is that if you traffic in the discourse of harm, if colleges and universities say, hey, you know what, we're really going to listen to students when they say my feelings have been hurt. We're going to take that seriously. Maybe we'll launch an investigation. But everybody hurts. Everybody's got feelings. And so
just sorry to interrupt, but look at the framing of the Stop Woke Act. It is based on the idea that if students feel psychological distress by virtue of any conversation about their ancestors having done things that portray them in negative light, then that should not be discussed in class. I mean, it's a very, very tricky thing and slippery thing when we start playing with harm, because it can be used by anyone. And the point is that the people who suffer at the end of the day are the students whose freedom to learn is being infringed upon.
Well, what I'm trying to say also is the flipping the script dynamic that you described before, Amna, is people who were concerned about quote-unquote snowflakes and that people were too sensitive. Some of these people are the same people who have made allegations about anti-Semitism. Not saying that those allegations don't have merit, but what we've seen on college campuses over the last year is almost these parallel tracks where students of Jewish descent are alleging anti-Semitism. Students of Palestinian descent or people who are in the pro-Palestinian movement are saying, well, hey, hold on a second, Islamophobia or anti-Palestinian bias or our voices are being silenced. So when you've created these conditions where the discourse of harm is the currency, anybody, any constituency can raise their hand and say, hey, what about me?
Everybody hurts.
Everybody hurts. Yeah. And so I hope that this would be an instructive lesson as Amna said, that free speech, free expression belongs to all of us. If we go the censorship route, censorship is a tool that unfortunately belongs to all of us, right? Whether you're on the right or whether you're on the left, there will be a group of people who are going to eagerly and aggressively embrace censorship to promote their political viewpoints. And I think having a better understanding of that kind of basic feature, this is a feature, not a bug, of humanity, of campus politics. There was an LA Times columnist who said that censorship is the strongest drive in human nature. Sex is a distant second. I think that's about accurate.
So in the context of looking at how university politics and sort of the student body is going to be reacting to each other, we have these different interests to sort of impose the same censorship on the other party. And we've thought about the purpose of the institution. And actually just a few days ago on November 8th, you co-authored this article that says, "Stop treating students like babies," with the Chronicle. And I'd love for you to iterate. I mean, you critique universities' response to the election by setting up spaces or with crafting or to provide counseling and dogs and sort of these emotionally meditative areas, which on the surface don't maybe seem like the worst thing. You're like, of all the things you could do, you're setting up, come and pet some dogs. But key into us and tell us why is this an issue, and what exactly should universities be providing for their students in this age where we're going to become where political conflict is so high?
Right. Let me begin with the 2016 election. Okay, like as someone who had come from Pakistan, and we have all kinds of people we elect, and many of them are very unsavory characters. So when I walked in 2016 into my classroom, I was, for one,
The day after the election?
The day after the election. I was gobsmacked by the reaction of my students because they were dysfunctional. And I just stood there and they expected me to not have class or to hold some kind of session where they could process these things. And I was like, well, again, it would behoove us to look beyond our borders and see that people have survived and do survive many, many far worse situations and circumstances. So it really kind of threw me off. And that was in 2016. So this time round, I actually had a conversation with my class the day before election saying, I will not be changing course and we will not be sitting. You want to process things by all means in a very constructive educational fashion where we should sit and contend with whatever the result is going to be and analyze it and think about it. But I am not going to be holding a space where people can just feel morose. And for me, what happened in the aftermath of the election results where institutions set up these self-care suites was basically the culmination of what we've been seeing happening for a few years now, where we are infantilizing students, where we're telling them that they're not able to think for themselves, where we're telling them that every time there's a problem, they need to run to an authority figure to resolve it. We're not equipping them with the kind of, I don't even want to call it courage, just basic skill of being able to disagree and confront someone you disagree with civilly, but kind of have that conversation, which is a difficult conversation, and that lies at the heart of the educational experience. So when, in the aftermath of the election results, I saw once again institutions responding in ways that frankly they would never have responded in if Kamala Harris had been elected. So let's just be honest over there. The idea that these are ideologically neutral interventions is nonsense. It's absolute rubbish, And so for me, I find that we, at a moment when we should really take stock and say, okay, what is it that we have done that has prevented our students from seeing what was the writing on the wall? We've put them in this bubble and they've never had a moment of engagement with the outside world. That is what we need to be reflecting on, not sitting there and having calming jars and, doggies to pet so that you can feel better. This is the time to get to work. This is the time to realize that we have failed so it's not our students that I blame. I want to be very clear about that. This is not a situation of snowflakes and, these kids. This is a situation where institutions need to look inside and say, we have failed them, and why have we failed them, such that our students are falling to pieces when this election result was announced. So for me, education is a tool of empowering people to think and contend and to learn to see the world as it is. You cannot even begin to change the world if you do not honestly see it as it is. And we have failed in helping our students do that. So I am a strong supporter of higher education. I will defend it when it comes to any kinds of attacks to academic freedom, be they internal or external. And at this moment, I think the threats to academic freedom are coming fast and furious from the outside. We need to be concerned. So I want to stand in, I think higher education has deep, deep value for a democracy. And I would like us as institutions to take this moment to pivot and remind ourselves, what are we there for? Re-embrace what our missions are and get to work, not sit there and, hand out hankies. That's really despicable and disgraceful.
Well, this is the triumph of a therapeutic model or a therapeutic approach to education that we've seen over the last 10 years. I mean, a lot of the listeners, I'm sure, are familiar with coddling of the American mind, but this emphasis on safetyism and what I was talking about before, the discourse of harm. Should colleges and universities have therapy available to individual students who have mental health issues? Absolutely. We have a professional and a moral obligation to take care of our students' health, including their mental health. But more broadly, therapy should be available for individuals, but that model of engagement with the world, I don't believe should be part of the educational mission. Therapy is not educational in the way that education is meant to proceed at a college or university. I think there is something interesting and ironic here, in that one of the knocks on Trump voters from social progressives and the left is that they aren't guided enough by reason. and that they're responding to these really powerful, affective, or emotional appeals, and that they're voting against their interests. They're being manipulated. Trump gets reelected for the second time, gets reelected. You're still shocked. And then you say, okay, let's wallow in our feelings. Let's express ourselves. Let's work through this. We're doing exactly the same sort of, what do I want to say?
It's the same reaction to what happened before.
It's the same kind of, let's really attend to our emotions and process our feelings. Like, sure, do that on your own time. But in a college and university, it's like, we got to set aside our feelings to talk about why so many college students and faculty and admin were floored by Trump's reelection. And you can't do that by wallowing in a self-care circuit or going to attend quote-unquote office hours. That is not going to advance your understanding of society. It has no educational value in terms of, as Amna said, seeing the world clearly as it is. You got to substitute critical thinking for wishful thinking. These spaces are all about wishful thinking.
I just want to say, there's something especially jarring and frankly nauseating to think there are people right now who are dying to have the right to an education. There are children who get shot in the face standing up to people who are denying them an education. There are women in Afghanistan who are crying out for the world to come in and help them at a moment when they really need help. And there are people in Gaza whose universities and schools have been decimated and they want an education. Does it behoove us to sit in our privilege and wallow and cancel classes when we are traumatized by the election of one candidate over another, which, no matter how you feel about it, is frankly a legit democratic process, and we have pathologized it?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, as I mentioned earlier, my freshman year was 2016, the election, after, everyone was surprised the first time, and it sort of set off this internal inquiry, because I was like, why am I so surprised? And I really didn't want to believe that, quote unquote, half of America would vote for Trump. I'm like, I don't think half of America is stupid. That would be really dumb of me to assume that of everybody else. So what is it that I was missing in understanding this outcome? And of course, that critical inquiry took me a gazillion different places, politically, religiously, philosophically, and it's been an adventure that hasn't always been very fun.
Adventures aren't meant to be fun; they're meant to be risky, right? That's what actually is part of an adventure.
And yes, what you're saying here is, there's a rush to judgment and a rush to condemnation. If this is baffling you, rather than saying what's wrong with Trump supporters, the question should be what's up with Trump supporters? How did Trump end up gaining so much more of the Black, Latino, and American Indian vote this time around? This is an interesting sociological question. But if you just stop with a knee-jerk emotional response those people are idiots, that is fundamentally anti-intellectual. So I think the move from your job is not to judge. Your first job in a classroom or any sort of educational environment is to try and understand. I'm not even talking about empathy. I think that's probably important on the realm of citizenship, and we're all in this together. But purely from an intellectual exercise, seeing the world for what it is, you've got to be primarily concerned and motivated by the urge to understand the world, not to stand and cast judgment and aspersions and ring down self-righteous condemnation on people who think differently. That's a dead end from an academic, scholarly, or pursuit of knowledge angle.
Yeah, well, just looking towards wrapping up, which I don't really want to. I have a gazillion more questions, but we don't want to keep our listeners for too long.
You can invite us again to Princeton.
Okay.
And we'll gladly come all the way just to have a conversation with you. This is fun.
Yeah, great questions.
I'm curious as we look towards, there's a number of things institutions can do. We're looking at also sort of the external risks to freedom of speech, but I think personally, when I look at this issue, I see that maybe the greatest risk is the self-censorship that can happen when it comes to associating very closely political beliefs with self-identity. And I just want to ask you, what do you tell your students and what do you say to individuals, not just students, because learning is a lifetime project, to foster that disposition of curiosity over that disposition of judgment? Because it's hard. That is a hard thing to do. And how do you instruct or develop that skill set in the people you're currently working and interacting with?
I'd love to answer that question, but I want to, before I get into it, I want to kind of disagree a little bit. I actually think self-censorship is indeed a grave threat to academic inquiry, but it's not the only big threat or the biggest threat. I actually think at this moment we need to be paying attention to what's coming out of legislatures who are going to be emboldened to interfere in our curricula. So I do not discount in any way, especially as someone who comes from a campus which is, it's completely liberal. So I do recognize and talk to my students a lot about the issue of self-censorship, and that this change that we are hankering after on college campuses is not a change that is merely going to be instituted by a change of policies, right? This is a cultural shift that we're talking about, and we need to work at it. We're all involved in it. We need to start modeling disagreement, embracing disagreement, and showing that actually disagreement is normal. Increasingly, as you begin to talk with people who look, speak, and think differently from you, you are going to have disagreement. And it is through that disagreement that we reap the benefits of diversity. There's no shortcut to the benefits of diversity, and you can bypass all this friction, but just suddenly find yourself, we're basking in diversity now. No. That's not how it works. The whole point is that you have that kind of friction and you have that kind of disagreement. And it starts with us. It starts with the administration and the faculty showing that we're okay with disagreement amongst ourselves, right? And moving away from this administrative approach, which is dominant on college campuses, that if there's disagreement, it needs to be managed. We don't manage disagreement. We lean into it to reap the full benefit of different perspectives and a diversity of viewpoints.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about it's an exceptionally, I think, significant and generative concept that comes out of librarianship and library sciences, which is intellectual freedom, which has a slightly different emphasis from academic freedom or free speech. I'm paraphrasing here, but the American Library Association defines intellectual freedom as something like the right to seek and access information and ideas from all points of view without restriction. That's a rough paraphrase. And what I'd like to encourage all of us to do, but especially, everyone, faculty, admin on campuses, but especially our students, self-censorship is about what you are willing to express in some form of social setting, whether that's classroom or your dorm room. But then there's our information diet or our media diet. And we've curated, based on our feeds, who we follow on social media, which magazines we subscribe to, which newspapers we read. We all have curated a kind of set of inputs that, no matter what your politics are, it's probably relatively narrow. It's a narrow band. And so I think just encouraging people, part of intellectual freedom isn't just the right to access the voices and listen to the voices of people you're going to agree with. But, follow Fox News on Twitter, go to the Breitbart website, subscribe to the National Review, actually talk to your friends and colleagues and family members who don't share your politics. But that takes it. That's a self-conscious, disciplined effort. But I think if we don't do that, if we don't make that effort, we really, again, won't be able to see the world very clearly. We will be stuck in our own little nook, in our own little corner.
Jeff, you've put your finger on it, right? It's like these things, reaching out and listening to voices you dislike, is an unnatural act in that it is not, nobody wants to do it. It goes against human nature. That's why we have higher education, where we cultivate repeatedly with discipline and thought these habits of mind, right? Which tell you that you are going to get a distorted view of the world if you keep sitting with people who agree with you and not listening to people who disagree with you. And for that reason, this is why disagreement is so central. And I hear many of the critiques about social media and how it feeds us, what we want to hear and these bubbles. Of course, that is all correct. But it's also made it equally that much easier to just push that little button where you say, follow Breitbart, follow Daily Mail. And within seconds, you will have a whole different array of ways in which people think about the world. So blaming social media, sure, I get all of that critique. I'm on board. But let's also just take some responsibility for not doing these things ourselves.
These are habits of mind or practices that one needs to cultivate and one needs to practice. I mean, around the time of the first, I'm not conservative, right? Like I'm left, center left. But when Trump first ran for president, I started reading and watching a lot of conservative news media because I wanted to understand how is he gaining so much traction, because it didn't make an intuitive sense to me. But I think these are things that you can't just do in small doses. Like, I'm going to watch 5 minutes of Fox News, because it actually takes practice to be exposed to views that you might find so challenging and so anathema at first. But the first step, I think, is just kind of building one's tolerance to be able to engage with different viewpoints. And then you can move beyond that gut reflex of, oh my gosh,
shut it off,
turn off the TV, unfollow. And actually find that, being a liberal, when I watch Fox News, 95% of it I think is bullshit. But 5% of the time I think they're onto something, and they're making valid points. And so again, I just think that these are there are no quick fixes, because as Amna said, this is fundamentally runs against our nature to conform, to close ranks, to feel comfortable, to just not think. Thinking is effortful and requires discipline. And the default is just kind of mental shortcuts. We all do it all the time. So I think one does have to be self-conscious about expanding your political horizons.
Yeah, and those mental shortcuts might have space in other walks of life, but not at institutions whose mission is to teach people how to think. That's the piece that I think is really important, and that's the piece that I think higher education really needs to reorient itself to, and that is what is going to allow us to defend ourselves from attacks, both from within and outside the academy.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. It's fantastic to both be in the room with you and to hear your perspectives and to get a better idea of your background. And of course, I wish that we could go on for much longer. But for our listeners, they write frequently, they publish frequently. So go check out their resources with a quick Google search and make sure to follow somebody you find really uncomfortable. Thanks for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having us, Laura. This was so much fun.
Yeah, really a pleasure. Thanks.
Thank you for tuning in on this week's episode of Madison's Notes. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. If you didn't, if you did, feel free to leave us a comment, a like. We will be going on a brief hiatus for the end-of-year Christmas holidays, so make sure to check back with us at the beginning of January for our next episode with renowned philosopher Charles Taylor. I'm Laura Laurent, and this has been Madison's Notes.